Welcome again to educator.com. And now, since you've read the Veldt, talked about it with some of your friends, you're now ready for this little short story recap on the Veldt. Let's talk about the author first. Our friend Ray Bradbury, who sadly is no longer with us. He has recently passed away. His best-known novels are Fahrenheit 451 and The Martian Chronicles. He is so famous that he actually has a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. And many of his works became movies, television episodes, and other adaptations. Most of these were in the 1950s and the 1960s. There was a show called Alfred Hitchcock Presents, and a lot of those came from Ray Bradbury's books. Now, finally, Ray Bradbury did not just get many awards, but he has an award named after him. So he is probably one of the best authors of the 20th century, at least in the United States, and he's contributed a lot to the genre of science fiction. Now, about this short story, there's a couple things that you should know about the context and the setting. Well, first off, it's the Veldt, aka The World Children Made Better, which was first published in 1950. Now, in 1950, this house cost $30,000. Now, if you adjust for inflation, that's $29,000 today. For perspective, $30,000 is about what a very, very smart person can make in 1 year at about age 20. $29,000, if you make that in a year, you are in the highest income tax bracket. Now, this has been adapted for radio and for television. In fact, maybe if you look it up on YouTube, you might find the story of the Veldt there. Finally, there is a famous video game called Final Fantasy VI, which was published by Square Enix, that actually had a subplot that was influenced by this story. So you can kind of see how far this story goes. Let's recap that Hollywood 3 act real quick. Act 1 is the introduction and exposition. And then we go through the first doorway when our protagonist does something important, or perhaps something dramatic happens to him that forces him to make a decision. Act 2 is all about the rising action. The tension's going to grow and grow and grow and escalate. And then it's going to explode into a climax in Act 3. And then there's going to be the downward motion. How does this story start out? Well, we got Lydia talking and we got George talking. Interestingly enough, we don't know what these characters are, who they are right now, but we learn pretty quickly. So, we're learning that they have something called a nursery. Now, nursery in this science fiction setting isn't just where you keep the babies, but think about what nursery does and what that means. So, George's wife paused in the middle of the kitchen, watched the stove busily humming to itself, making a supper for 4. It's just that the nursery is different than it was. All right, says George, let's have a look. Keep in mind this was written in the 1950s, where the ideal family was, basically leave it to Beaver, where the, husband works and the wife doesn't do anything but cook and clean. She's not even having to cook in this science fiction setting here. Let's continue with Act 1. They walked down the wall of their happy life home that had cost them $30,000. Now remember, how much does this actually cost? Well, in today's dollars, that's almost $300,000, which is a very, very wealthy person. So what do we know about this couple? The house was clothed, fed, and rocked them to sleep, and played and sang, and was good to them. Their approach sensitized a switch somewhere in the nursery, and a light flickered on and came within 10 feet of it. Similarly, the hall lights went on and off as they left behind with soft automaticity. What do you think automaticity means? Think about those Greek words in context real quick if you're not sure. What do we know about this house? Well, we know that even though in the 1950s it was always the wife's job to cook, the house is cooking for them. We know that this house is expensive And we know that this house is, rocking them to sleep, it's waking them up, and lights are going on and off automatically. Now, once they actually get into the nursery, they see the lions, and then the lions seem very, very real because it's, like a holodeck on Star Trek practically. And then the lions come at them. "Watch out," screamed Lydia. The lions came running at them. Lydia bolted and ran. Instinctively, George sprang after her. Outside in the hall, with the door slammed, he was laughing and she was crying. They both stood appalled at each other's reactions. And then George, Lydia, oh my poor sweet Lydia, the fake lions almost got us. Is there a conflict here? Is there foreshadowing? Is there anything that we know about this house and this home so far that's a little odd and out of place? So, Act 1 is going to end with the first doorway, and you remember that the first door is when the protagonist makes a decision and something happens that gets to the point of no return. What do? Lydia says, "Lock the nursery for a few days." Oh, excuse me, this is George speaking. "George, I'll lock the nursery for a few days until I get my nerves settled." And Lydia says, "You know how difficult Peter is about that. When I punished him a month ago by locking the nursery for even a few hours, the tantrum he threw. And Wendy too. They live for the nursery." George says, "It's got to be locked. That's all there is to it." Who is our protagonist then? Who's making the decision that's going to go into Act 2? Our protagonist, George. How is this going to move towards Act 2? Let's continue on. Act 2, we meet the kids. And are they like, kids on Leave It to Beaver? Well, maybe. First off, I noticed a couple things that are unusual about this story, and I hope you did too. First off, who's eating dinner alone here? Well, the parents. Wendy and Peter were off somewhere else. They were off at a plastic carnival across town. And they continue to discuss everything that's going on in the house. Another interesting statement here is, too much of anything isn't good for anyone. And clearly they had indicated that the children had been spending too much time in Africa. So, and what do these kids think about when they're in the nursery? Well, the children thought about lions, and there were lions. The children thought about zebras, and there were zebras. Sun, giraffes. We have children thinking about death. How is this raising a question in the reader's mind? What kind of things do you think about? Well, I might wonder, okay, if this is a 1950s happy life home, it doesn't seem very happy if the family's not all eating together. And also, death isn't happy, and I generally don't think about young children contemplating death too much, especially in a happy life home, 1950s kind of culture. So, let's continue on with Act 2. This is the father speaking with the children. All about Africa and everything, the father said with false joviality. Look up joviality if you're not sure what that means. And why is it false? "I don't understand," said zombie child Peter. "Your mother and I were traveling through Africa with Rod and Wheel, Tom Swift and his electric lion," said George Hadley. "There's no Africa in the nursery," Peter said simply. "Oh, come on, Peter. We know better." "I don't remember any Africa," said Peter to Wendy. "Do you?" "No." What's happening here? Happy life home, perfect family. Why is Peter and Wendy lying to their parents? What does that imply about the relationships that's going on in this family right here? Continuing on with Act 2, George gets a visit from a psychologist. And this is what the psychologist says. A psychologist never saw fact in his life. He only hears about feelings, vague things. "This isn't good, I tell you. Trust my hunches and my instincts. I have a nose for something bad, and this is very bad. My advice to you, George Hadley, father, is that you have the whole damn room torn down and your children brought every day to me next year for treatment." Now remember what they had found in the nursery at this point and what the psychologist is so concerned about. Go ahead and reread this part. Now, remember, we're in Act 2. This is all about rising action. We've seen some tension. We've asked some questions. How does the psychologist's advice create more rising action at this point of the story? How is it escalating the conflict? Now, before we get into Act 3, I'd like you to I'm not going to give away the climax in case you haven't read it, but here's what happens. What does George finally do to move the story to Act 3? And what finally happens at the end? Why does the story end the way it does? A very, very peculiar ending and actually kind of grim. But I think most of us who were reading it saw it coming. So, for your written response, here's what I'd like you to do. You can pick any one of these 3 questions and write 200 to 350 words. Do you think George Hadley is a tragic hero? And go ahead and rewatch the lessons if you're not sure what a tragic hero is. And if he is a tragic hero, what flaws in his character make him one? How about an imaginative response? Write a response as if you were the psychologist working with David McLean. What is your diagnosis of the children, and what do you recommend as treatment? And another really creative response, if you're willing to, is you can rewrite just part of the story from an anti-hero's perspective. So I don't mean make George Hadley an anti-hero. I mean pick one of the children and write the story from their perspective. Till then, enjoy your reading and enjoy this writing, and we'll continue on with more literature in the next lesson and educate.